On the edge of Europe, where land gives way to water, there are places that feel strangely unfinished. Quiet beaches, where the sand stretches wide, as if waiting. Harbours where the tide pulls away and exposes smooth stone and dark silt. Cliffs that stand still, watching a horizon that never answers back. These are familiar scenes, photographed endlessly, spoken of as permanent. Yet when you stand there long enough, especially at dusk, it can feel as though something is missing. Not ruined, not destroyed, just absent, like a memory you can almost reach but never quite touch. The story begins here, not beneath the sea, but beside it. Long before boats traced these waters and borders fixed themselves to maps, the line between land and ocean lay far beyond today's shore. Where waves now move in patient rhythm, there were valleys that held mist at sunrise, marshlands alive with birdsong, and rivers that carried people instead of reflections. What we call coastline was once inland. What we call sea was once travelled on foot, crossed slowly, learned intimately through seasons rather than storms. For thousands of years, ordinary lives unfolded in those now submerged places. Families moved with the weather. Hunters learned where animals gathered. Children grew beneath skies that looked no different from ours. There were no temples announcing greatness, no written records insisting on permanence. There was simply continuity. Day followed day. Generations followed generations. The land did not need to be conquered because it already belonged to those who understood it. And because nothing about life there seemed extraordinary at the time, it left behind no warning of how completely it would vanish. What removed these worlds from view was not war or collapse, but patience. After the last ice age, the planet warmed, almost imperceptibly at first. Ice retreated, water expanded. Year by year, the sea crept forward, not with violence, but with certainty. Shorelines shifted, lowlands flooded, paths became channels. No moment announced itself as the end. There was no single night when everything drowned. Instead, there was adaptation, retreat, return, and then retreat again, until memory itself no longer knew where to point. This slow erasure left history with a problem it rarely acknowledges. We tend to imagine the past as a place we can excavate, dig into, and classify. But that assumes the ground remains where it was. In Europe, some of the oldest human stories no longer sit beneath soil. They rest beneath meters of water, softened by currents, covered by silt, and sealed away from casual discovery. The archive is not lost. It is simply unreachable by habits built for dry land. Because these cultures did not fall in flame or famine, they rarely appear in our collective imagination. There are no legends of conquest, no ruins rising dramatically from fields. Their disappearance was so gentle that it barely registered as an ending. People adjusted, moved inland, merged with others, carried fragments of knowledge forward without naming their origin. What disappeared was not humanity, but context. And without context, history grows quiet. The ocean, in this sense, becomes something more complex than a destroyer. It preserves, even as it conceals. Wood survives in its depths. Footprints remain pressed into ancient mud. Tools rest where they were set down, untouched by fire or plough. At the same time, the sea rearranges, distorts, and hides, making certainty difficult and patience necessary. It gives just enough to keep questions alive, while holding back enough to prevent easy answers. When we speak of prehistory, we often imagine a simpler world, thinly populated and loosely organized. But the lands now beneath Europe's waters tell a different story. They suggest planning, movement, and long familiarity with changing environments. They hint at social worlds built on adaptation rather than dominance. These were not people waiting for civilization to arrive. They were living within one, shaped by coastlines that no longer exist. There is something unsettling in realizing how easily a culture can slip beyond recognition without violence or failure. No warning sirens sound when memory fades. No line separates what will be remembered from what will not. The sea simply advances, and with it, silence. What remains on the surface seems complete, even though entire chapters lie below, unread and uncounted. This is the edge of the story, the place where certainty loosens its grip. Before voices are named and lives reconstructed, the listener is asked only to notice what feels absent, to stand at the shoreline and consider that beneath familiar waves rests a world that never announced its departure. Once that thought settles, it becomes impossible not to wonder who lived there, and why their quiet disappearance still matters. The absence of sudden endings makes these lost worlds harder to imagine, but also more human. They did not break. They thinned, stretched, and dissolved across time. People left behind marks they assumed would last, because nothing suggested otherwise. Fire pits cooled, paths softened, familiar landmarks drifted out of reach. Standing on today's coast, it becomes clear that disappearance does not always feel like loss when it happens slowly. It feels like adjustment. And adjustment, repeated enough times, becomes a way of life rather than a tragedy remembered. In the chapters that follow, the story will move deeper, away from the safety of the present shoreline, and toward the people who once depended on these vanished lands. For now, it is enough to sit with the idea that what we know is shaped as much by water as by time. The sea did not erase these cultures out of cruelty or intention. It simply rose, quietly, doing what seas have always done. And in rising, it carried entire histories just beyond reach, leaving us with edges to stand on and questions to carry forward. Only after accepting that the sea was once land can we begin asking the deeper question: who shaped those places, and how their lives ripple faintly through the Europe we know today, still now. Europe, as we are taught to imagine it, is a shape with edges. It has borders drawn in ink, coastlines traced with confidence, and names assigned to nearly every visible space. This version of the continent feels stable and complete, as if it has always looked this way. Yet that image is recent, fragile, and misleading. For most of human existence, Europe had no fixed outline. Its edges breathed. They expanded and withdrew with seasons, centuries, and slow changes that left no single moment to be remembered as the beginning or the end. To see the continent as it once was requires letting go of maps and learning to think in motion rather than lines. Before harbours, before ports, before the idea of a shoreline as a destination, rivers ran farther than memory now allows. They stretched across land that today lies beneath water, branching and rejoining across wide plains before reaching an ocean much farther away. Where modern cities pressed tightly against the sea, there were wetlands that calmed tides and fields that accepted seasonal flooding without harm. These places were not empty margins. They were centres of life. They were settled, understood, and relied upon as deeply as any inland valley. In this older Europe, movement mattered more than permanence. People followed animals across open ground that no longer exists. They crossed routes now hidden beneath waves, never imagining those paths would one day be broken. What seems, from a modern view, like bold migration, would have felt ordinary and practical. The land supported it. The terrain permitted it. There were no abrupt edges declaring an end to travel. No dramatic borders separating one world from another. The continent offered continuity rather than division. Without fixed borders, regions blended naturally. Knowledge moved alongside people, carried through habit and shared experience rather than control. Skills, stories, and survival techniques traveled freely. Communities overlapped, separated, and reconnected as landscapes shifted. Isolation was rare because geography encouraged contact. People lived inside networks, shaped by landforms that changed slowly enough to watch, but not slowly enough to ignore. What defines this lost geography is not its scale, but its attention to rhythm. Daily life was organized around return and departure, season and migration, water and ground. Knowing patterns mattered more than claiming space. Coastal societies, especially, learned to read subtle signals early. The changing edge of land demanded awareness. Adaptation was not a response to crisis. It was a daily practice. Change was expected, even trusted. Later histories often describe these communities as early or incomplete, positioned at the margins of progress. But living close to shifting coastlines required confidence, not simplicity. It demanded foresight, flexibility, and careful observation. These societies became skilled interpreters of instability. They recognized long changes before they became visible disasters. Long before writing preserved such knowledge, it was lived, repeated, and shared. The land itself taught these lessons. As ice retreated and water advanced, familiar places softened, camps moved, paths adjusted, memory adapted with geography. Knowledge passed through action rather than record. Nothing about this process felt like collapse. It happened quietly. People did not vanish. Their surroundings changed beneath them. Modern Europe often presents itself as ancient and immovable, layered with stone, boundaries, and permanence. But beneath that image lies a deeper continuity, shaped by motion rather than solidity. The continent's earliest cultures did not build stability through stillness. They lived within uncertainty without fear. Imagining Europe before the shoreline existed means visualizing connection instead of division. Land extending outward, water retreating and returning, people moving with both. As this older landscape settles into the mind, the sea begins to look less like a border and more like a veil. And with that understanding, the story is ready to move closer, toward the place where this vanished world remained visible longest, waiting to be noticed. There was a time when Britain was not an island, and this fact was not remarkable. No waves marked a boundary between one people and another. No crossings needed boats or courage. The separation we now take for granted did not yet exist, and for thousands of years, no one had reason to imagine that it ever would. Between what is now eastern England and the lowlands of continental Europe stretched a broad, living landscape known today as Doggerland. Not a narrow bridge, not a temporary passage, but a place meant to be lived in. Doggerland was vast and generous. Wide plains rolled gently beneath open skies. Rivers braided through the land, slow and full, carrying fish in numbers that returned each season with steady reliability. Forests grew thick along their banks, sheltering deer, boar, and smaller game. Wetlands shifted with the year, creating rich ground for birds and plants that sustained human life without exhaustion. This was not an edge of civilization. It was a center, balance between water and land, shaped by both. People were born in Doggerland and buried there. Children learned the curves of its rivers as they learned to walk. Paths formed over generations, not because they were forced, but because they worked. Families followed familiar routes, returning to favored places that offered shelter and food in predictable rhythms. Knowledge accumulated here quietly, refined by repetition rather than invention. The land taught, and people listened. From this place, movement flowed outward. Ideas traveled as easily as footsteps. Relationships extended across regions now divided by sea. What modern maps label as separate nations were once parts of a continuous social world. Tools, customs, and stories crossed Doggerland without regard for future borders. The land allowed connection, and connection shaped identity. It is tempting to think of Doggerland only as something crossed, a corridor linking elsewhere. But for those who lived there, it was not between worlds. It was their world. The rivers were not routes through a place. They were destinations. The forests were not obstacles. They were providers. The coast, distant at the time, did not threaten. It framed life, rather than pressing against it. As climates warmed, changes began, though they were easy to overlook at first. Wet ground spread where dry ground once held firm. Coastlines crept inward, then paused, then resumed their slow advance. People adjusted as they always had. Camps moved a little higher. Seasonal patterns shifted. Nothing suggested urgency. There were no threats to flee, no walls to break. The sea did not arrive as an enemy. It arrived as a visitor who stayed longer each year. Familiar hunting grounds softened into marsh. Pathways flooded during high seasons and returned again. For generations, Doggerland remained usable, if altered. Its people did not experience sudden loss. They experienced management, patience, and adaptation. Life continued because it could. This slow transformation is why Doggerland left so little drama behind. There was no final exodus, no burning horizon etched into memory. People did not abandon their homeland in fear. They followed opportunity as it shifted, carrying their knowledge inland, eastward, westward. The land thinned beneath them, until one day it no longer offered enough reason to return. What makes Doggerland unsettling is not how it ended, but how complete it once was. This was no forgotten fringe. It supported populations large enough to shape regional culture. It anchored relationships that later civilizations inherited without realizing their depth. And yet, because Doggerland disappeared before writing fixed memory into record, it occupies no firm place in familiar European history. The absence feels intentional until one looks closer. It was not erased because it failed or because it mattered little. It vanished because it succeeded quietly, allowing people to leave without catastrophe. History tends to remember what breaks loudly. Doggerland dissolved, and dissolution rarely demands attention. Standing on today's shores, it is difficult to feel the weight of what is missing. The sea appears eternal, confident, complete. But beneath it lies a landscape that shaped Europe as profoundly as any later kingdom. A place where connection mattered more than division, where borders did not yet interfere with belonging. Once Doggerland is understood as a lived homeland rather than a passage, its absence becomes harder to ignore. An entire heartland sits beneath moving water, unannounced and largely unseen. And with that realization comes an unavoidable question, one that lingers calmly rather than urgently. If this place supported life for so long, and if its departure left so little trace, how exactly did it fade from the surface of the world at all? For generations, the changes in Doggerland had followed a pattern people understood. Water moved, ground softened, familiar places adjusted their shape, but life continued. Nothing suggested that one day would matter more than the ones before it. There was no reason to expect a line between before and after, and yet, far to the north, beyond what anyone living there could see or sense, the earth shifted in a way that did not offer time to adapt. Beneath the cold waters off what is now Norway, a vast section of the seabed collapsed, not with sound that could travel across distances, but with force enough to displace oceans. The Storga slide was not an event witnessed directly by those farther south. It announced itself differently. The sea withdrew where it should not. The horizon behaved strangely. Water that had always arrived gently pulled back, then returned with unfamiliar intention. When the wave reached Doggerland, it did not arrive as a towering wall of destruction, the way later stories imagined disasters. It moved unevenly, spilling across low ground, pouring into river systems, spreading salt far beyond the shoreline. It was confusing rather than spectacular. The danger was hard to see while it was happening. The land absorbed it, temporarily, as it had absorbed floods before. People would not have understood what they were witnessing as the end of anything. Some may have climbed to higher ground. Others waited, trusting the land to recover as it always had. When the water receded, much of Doggerland still stood. Forests remained. Rivers flowed. Animals returned. But something essential had changed in ways that only time would reveal. Salt lingered in soil that had once been fertile. Crops failed quietly. Plants that fed both people and animals refused to grow. Rivers altered their routes, no longer behaving as they once had. Marshland expanded where stable ground had been relied upon. What looked like recovery at first revealed itself instead as unreliability. This was not a catastrophe that erased a people overnight. It was far more unsettling than that. It introduced doubt into a relationship that had always felt dependable. The land no longer responded the way memory said it should. Familiar knowledge failed. Predictable patterns slipped. Over the years that followed, returning to Doggerland became more difficult. Seasonal camps were abandoned not in fear, but in practicality. Why stay where effort no longer returned reward? Families moved incrementally, inland or toward higher ground, carrying their skills with them. The land that had once anchored connection thinned into something that demanded more than it gave. Nothing about this process created ruins worth remembering. There were no walls collapsing, no cities sinking dramatically beneath waves. Structures made of wood and earth faded quickly. Footpaths softened. Fire pits cooled and disappeared beneath shifting sediment. The landscape itself collaborated in forgetting. To future eyes, it would appear as if Doggerland had simply emptied. Archaeological silence would suggest absence rather than departure. But people did not vanish. They dispersed. They merged into nearby regions, becoming ancestors without names. Their traditions blurred into others. Their homeland faded not because it was destroyed, but because it stopped making sense to return. This distinction matters. History often frames endings as moments of violence or failure. Doggerland challenges that instinct. Its people were not defeated. They were outpaced by change that arrived just fast enough to break continuity, but slow enough to leave no clear ending to remember. The Storga slide did not wipe Doggerland from the map in a single stroke. It altered the balance, and once balance was lost, the long withdrawal that had begun centuries earlier accelerated quietly. Within a few hundred years, land that once connected worlds lay mostly beneath shallow seas, fragmented into islands and shoals that offered no stable future. Those who left would not have spoken of loss the way later generations imagine it. They would have spoken of movement, of choosing better ground, of leaving behind places that no longer served life. There was no language for disappearance, because disappearance implies intention. This is why Doggerland remains difficult to hold in memory. Its ending did not demand witnesses. It produced no monuments to catastrophe, only absence filtered through time. History did not record its fall because those living through it did not recognize it as a fall at all. Standing now at the edge of the North Sea, it is hard to imagine that such a complete world once occupied this space. Waves move steadily, indifferent to what lies beneath them. Yet the sea here did something unusual. It did not come and go. It arrived, changed the rules, and stayed. What destroys a culture is not always what kills its people. Sometimes it is what alters the ground beneath expectation. Doggerland's people survived, adapted, and carried on. But their homeland did not. And once its reliability was gone, its memory loosened with it. Doggerland is not a singular story, frozen in the past. It is an early example of a pattern repeated along Europe's coastlines, where land gave way without violence and cultures slipped quietly out of focus. Its fate echoes outward, waiting to be noticed, long after the water settled. There are stories that seem impossible to drown. They resurface again and again, in different languages, told by people separated by mountains, seas, and centuries. Long before historians tried to organize the past into timelines, these stories were already moving quietly through memory. They speak of lands swallowed by water, of prosperous places lost, of warnings delivered too late. They are often dismissed as invention, yet their persistence suggests something harder to erase. Among them, Atlantis stands apart. Not because it is uniquely detailed, but because it is so familiar. Plato's account has been argued over for generations, treated either as fiction, philosophy, or elaborate metaphor. But what matters more than deciding whether Atlantis existed is asking why this story, in particular, refused to fade. Why did a philosopher choose a sinking land as his lesson? Why did water, rather than fire or war, carry the weight of loss? Flood stories recur across Europe and the Mediterranean, with unsettling consistency. Rivers overflowing their bounds, seas rising beyond what people remembered, entire regions becoming uninhabitable. These tales appear in cultures that never met, preserved not with precision, but with feeling. Details drift, names change, moral lessons sharpen or soften, yet the core remains. Land was once here, now it is not. Rather than evidence of imagination running wild, these myths can be understood as compression. When exact knowledge slips away, memory reshapes what remains. Emotional truth survives longer than measured fact. A coastline lost over centuries becomes a sudden drowning, because slow change is difficult to tell as story. Community dispersal becomes divine punishment, because warning is easier to remember than adaptation. Atlantis, in this light, reads less like prophecy and more like echo. Plato did not need to invent fear of the sea. His audience already lived within its consequences. Coastal changes were well within living memory. If not personal, then communal. The story offered shape to a sensation many understood instinctively, that the world could change faster than societies expected. Myths endure because they serve a purpose beyond accuracy. They transmit caution. They imprint unease. They warn listeners without burdening them with technical detail. Long before writing systems could record sea level timelines or geological events, stories held what mattered emotionally. Stay alert. Change arrives quietly. Stability cannot be assumed. The longer a culture depends on spoken memory, the more necessary such framing becomes. Without monuments or documents to preserve exact knowledge, narrative does the work. Myths exaggerate not to deceive, but to endure. They choose symbols that survive forgetting. Water, immense and uncontrollable, becomes the carrier of truth. Seen this way, Atlantis may not represent a single place. It may represent many. A blending of drowned plains, abandoned coasts, and communities that watched familiar ground slowly become unreachable. As these experiences layered across generations, they compressed into symbol. One island sank, so that many losses could be remembered as one. This approach does not require belief or disbelief. It simply arrests dismissal. Myths need not be literal to be valuable. They are emotional records written when other forms of writing were unavailable or insufficient. Treating them as pure fantasy strips them of their function and obscures the experiences that shaped them. When a society loses land gradually, there is no witness who can point to the beginning. There is no date to mark. But a story can hold the shape of what happened without anchoring it to time. That is how memory survives floodlines, migrations, and the quiet dissolving of homeland. It is not accidental that so many of these stories are framed as moral lessons. Moral framing arrests attention. It ensures repetition. Children remember warnings more clearly than measurements. The sea becomes a character, not because it was angry, but because it was powerful and indifferent. What survives in myth is not geography, but mood. The unease of watching water advance. The humility of realizing human planning has limits. The sense that something precious slipped away while people believed it would always return. This is why, thousands of years later, names like Atlantis still invite curiosity. They linger on the border between evidence and imagination, where questions feel safer than conclusions. And once myth is understood as memory rather than mistake, it becomes possible to look again at the sea, not as a storyteller's canvas, but as an archive. Because if stories survived where stone did not, then the next step is unavoidable. Somewhere beneath water, real places may still exist, waiting not for belief, but for notice. And once myth is allowed to guide attention instead of replacing evidence, the narrative can turn toward what remains below the surface, quiet and physical, long after the stories learned how to float. When myths are allowed to rest beside the land, rather than above it, something subtle begins to happen. Stories that once felt untethered start aligning with places that still exist, though changed. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough to make dismissal feel premature. Along the Mediterranean, this quiet alignment becomes difficult to ignore. The shores here have never been stable. For thousands of years, they have advanced and withdrawn, reshaped by rising water and settling earth. What are now ports and promenades were once dry ground. What are now lagoons and bays held villages, paths, and working coastlines. This region has always lived close to movement, and memory adapted as shorelines changed. In several parts of the Mediterranean, fishermen have long told stories of stone anchors snagging on shapes that do not belong to reefs. Divers describe straight edges where erosion should rule. Sonar reveals outlines that resemble breakwaters, walls, and submerged harbours far below current sea level. None of these discoveries declare a single lost civilization, but together they form an unsettling pattern. Human presence appears older and deeper than expected. Near today's coasts, stone tools have been recovered from seabeds well beyond what tides could plausibly explain. These objects did not wash out to sea. They remained where they were used, later carried under as water rose. Oral histories from nearby inland communities speak of ancestors who once lived closer to the horizon, in lands that no longer return. The stories are vague, blurred by time, yet persistent. What is striking is not their accuracy, but their consistency. Across different regions, the pattern repeats. Land lost to water. People moving away, not in defeat, but in necessity. The sea crossing former boundaries and redefining where life could continue. The myths do not record dates or names. They preserve feeling instead. In some areas, ancient harbours now sit dozens of meters underwater, carved into landscapes that only make sense when imagined dry. In others, stone arrangements appear too deliberate to explain through natural formation alone, yet too eroded to identify cleanly. Each discovery on its own can be doubted. Together, they resist simplification. The temptation is to force clarity, to name a place, assign a culture, declare a conclusion. But the strength of this evidence lies in its restraint. These coastlines do not shout, they murmur. They offer fragments rather than narratives. And it is precisely this incompleteness that mirrors mythology so closely. Ancient people were not trying to preserve geography. They were trying to preserve awareness. Stories warned of places that no longer return, of choices that depend on listening to land rather than trusting familiarity. When water advances, usefulness determines survival more than belief. This explains why myth outlasted stone. A wall sinks and disappears. A story adjusts and remains. It sheds detail, sharpens meaning, and passes forward what matters. Flood myths taught that movement was not failure, that stability could be temporary, and that land itself was something to read rather than command. In this light, the Mediterranean stories are not proof of Atlantis or any singular lost world. They are reminders of many small losses layered into one shared caution. Each submerged cove and drowned plain contributed to a collective memory that stopped needing specifics to function. As modern technology peers into shallow seas, it often encounters resistance from expectation. The assumption that early people stayed inland collapses when tools appear underwater. The belief that coasts were marginal weakens when evidence suggests long occupation. Doubt shifts direction. Instead of questioning whether myths exaggerated reality, it becomes harder not to question whether reality has been underestimated. This is how coincidence accumulates into possibility, not through declarations but through persistence. The same pattern appearing in different places, the same stories echoing across unrelated cultures, the same terrains revealing traces exactly where memory insisted something once stood. Ancient people did not encode disaster to entertain future generations. They encoded responsibility. Knowledge of environmental change became narrative, because narrative travels farther than instruction. Myths survived because they worked. They shaped behavior long after geography changed. Standing above these submerged coastlines, it becomes clear that stories were never meant to replace evidence. They were meant to endure until evidence would be needed again. And now, as attention turns downward, toward the seafloor itself, those stories feel less like fantasy and more like signposts pointing quietly beneath the waves. From here, the narrative must shift again. Beyond story and suggestion lies something more solid, waiting in darkness, unchanged by belief. The sea holds objects that did not learn how to float, and it is there, among stone and tool and sediment, that the next layer of this hidden world begins to surface. No one was searching for lost worlds when the first objects came up. There were no expeditions with banners, no announcements of discovery. The finds arrived quietly, tangled in fishing nets, scraped by dredging equipment, revealed as interruptions in ordinary work. Modern industry, moving without curiosity, brushed against something far older than itself and did not recognize it at first. Fishermen in the North Sea began noticing weight where there should have been none. Shapes that did not feel like rock or coral, but resisted the net with a familiar, unnatural firmness. When dragged to the surface, these objects looked out of place. Stone tools, shaped by hands rather than waves. Pieces of worked wood, darkened by time but unmistakably altered. Bones carrying marks that water alone could not explain. They were not discoveries in the heroic sense. They were inconveniences. At first, these returns were dismissed as drift. A tool lost from a ship. A fragment carried far from shore by storm or current. But the same shapes kept appearing, again and again, from areas far offshore, well beyond where such objects were supposed to exist. The sea was offering them up without ceremony, as if it had always held them there, uninterested in whether anyone noticed. Similar moments followed elsewhere. Sonar scans meant to map pipelines and seabeds began revealing straight lines where no straight lines should be. Curves too deliberate to be random. Patterns that did not fit seabed geology. These were not ruins rising clearly from sand. They were suggestions, interruptions in expectation, enough to make technicians pause and look again. What unsettled researchers was not the presence of objects alone, but their context. Stone tools cannot float. Hearth remains cannot migrate on their own. Worked wood does not arrange itself beneath meters of sediment by accident. These things had not travelled to the seafloor. The seafloor had travelled to them. The realization arrived slowly, resistively. The timeline was wrong, or rather, incomplete. Long-held assumptions about where early people lived relied heavily on what could be found easily. Inland remains survived, ploughs and buildings. Coastal sites vanished beneath water and were quietly excluded. Archaeology, for all its care, had learned to look forward and downward, but rarely beneath waves. What made these accidental discoveries so destabilizing was their ordinariness. There was nothing ceremonious about them. A hand axe embedded in silt has no drama. A piece of charred wood does not announce its significance. And yet, together, they pressed against a question that had not been openly asked. If people lived here long enough to leave these objects behind, then the map of early settlement had always been incomplete. Modern progress played an unintended role. The same machines built to extract resources, to haul nets, or to stabilize infrastructure became tools of reveal. Industry stumbled into history not because it was searching, but because it was interfering. The seabed, disturbed for practical reasons, yielded evidence it had preserved patiently. This reframes progress in an uncomfortable way. Advancement did not merely uncover the past, it disrupted it. The sudden appearance of ancient tools forced acknowledgement that entire chapters of human presence lay unseen until disturbed. It raised the unsettling possibility that much remains buried simply because nothing has yet passed over it. Underwater archaeology did not begin with curiosity. It began with annoyance, objects in the wrong place, refusing to stay hidden, interrupting schedules. This lends the discoveries a strange credibility. They were not sought to confirm a theory. They appeared first, demanding explanation afterward. As more finds accumulated, patterns formed. The objects appeared in clusters, not randomly. They aligned with ancient river systems now submerged, with landscapes that only made sense when imagined above water. Hearth remains suggested repeated use, not passing presence. These were not anomalies. They were neighborhoods erased by sea. Each recovered artifact carried quiet contradiction. According to accepted timelines, no one should have been there in such numbers, at such times, with such familiarity with the land. Stone tools implied hunting and planning. Hearths implied return. Woodworking implied structure, even if temporary. Together, they painted a picture of lived space rather than fleeting occupation. The unease deepened with a simple thought. If all of this surfaced accidentally, what remains untouched? Fishing trawlers cover only portions of the seabed. Sonar scans focus on narrow corridors. Vast areas remain undisturbed, their contents unknown, not because they are absent, but because they have not been interrupted. The sea did not hide these objects deliberately. It simply covered them, slowly, evenly, without preference. Human attention moved elsewhere, inland, upward, toward what remained visible. History followed attention. Prehistory slipped quietly out of view. What these accidental finds revealed was not a singular lost culture, but a blind spot. An entire category of human experience had been excluded because it sat beneath water. Coastal life, which depended on mobility and adaptation, left fewer durable structures than inland stone cities. Its disappearance was easier to overlook. These objects now force reconsideration without demanding belief. They do not tell stories, they ask questions. They suggest that people were present where they were not supposed to be, using tools they were expected to lack, living lives too ordinary to leave monuments, but too sustained to be ignored. Once objects are found, explanations follow reluctantly. And once explanations enter, deeper questions arise. If people occupied these submerged lands for so long, what did they know? How did they build, organize, and adapt? The seafloor has begun to return fragments, and those fragments do not simply add detail. They destabilize the frame entirely, opening the narrative toward abilities once assumed impossible. The objects pulled from the sea did more than fill display cases. They unsettled a long-held picture of early coastal life as simple, scattered, and temporary. For a long time, people who lived near ancient shorelines were described as foragers passing through, opportunistic rather than deliberate. This view survived, not because it was proven, but because so little direct evidence remained. What surfaced from beneath the water quietly disagreed. Stone tools recovered from submerged land were not crude experiments. Their shapes showed consistency, balance, and intention. Points were designed for specific animals. Cutting edges were maintained rather than replaced. This implies planning across time, not improvisation in isolation. Tools were made to last, repaired when possible, and discarded only when necessary. Such choices suggest knowledge passed between generations, not moments of trial and error. Hearth remains told an even clearer story. Fire sites found underwater were not random burns. They appeared in clusters, used repeatedly, positioned with awareness of wind and shelter. This points to return, to memory, to place-based living. People did not drift endlessly across coastlines. They came back, season after season, trusting the land to behave as it always had. Seasonal movement itself required intelligence of a particular kind. Coastal environments change constantly. Tides reshape access to food. Weather alters travel routes. Animals move unpredictably. To survive here demanded long observation and shared knowledge. These people did not dominate their surroundings. They listened to them. Adaptation was not a reaction. It was a skill. Resource management left subtle traces. Shell middens appeared not as piles of waste, but as deliberate deposits near reliable gathering areas. Fishing tools reflected awareness of migration cycles rather than chance capture. Wood fragments showed careful selection, shaped for purpose rather than convenience. None of this suggests excess or exploitation. It suggests balance. What becomes clear is that intelligence did not present itself through monument or hierarchy. It appeared through restraint, timing, and cooperation. Coastal societies operated as systems tuned to change, not stable empires built for permanence. Their success left fewer hard traces because it did not rely on forcing the land into stillness. Later civilizations measured advancement through stone, record, and permanence. Coastal peoples measured it through continuity. Knowledge lived within practice rather than structure. It was carried in habit, enforced by environment, and refined through repetition. When the sea advanced, these systems responded until response no longer worked. This is where misunderstandings set in. When evidence disappeared beneath water, so did appreciation of complexity. What could no longer be seen was assumed never to have existed. Simpler narratives replaced missing ones. Coastal life was reduced to survival rather than strategy. Yet the evidence does not support that reduction. Planning requires foresight. Seasonal management requires communication. Shared return points imply agreement and memory. These were societies that balanced movement with familiarity, freedom with coordination. They were not chaotic, they were flexible. Flexibility, however, does not leave monuments. It leaves objects placed briefly, used carefully, and abandoned without drama. When water arrived, it covered that record evenly, removing context along with detail. History, following what remained visible inland, adjusted its assumptions accordingly. This is how underestimation takes root. Intelligence is measured by what survives, not by what worked. Coastal societies worked well enough to avoid collapse. They relocated rather than resisted. They adapted without spectacle. From the outside, that looks like absence, but from within, it was understanding. These people recognized coastlines as living systems, never fixed, never promised. They did not build as if the land were permanent. They lived as if it would change. That awareness, carried quietly across generations, was its own form of sophistication. The realization arrives without drama. There is no sudden upgrade in human ability, no lost golden age. There is only correction. A recognition that simplicity and intelligence are not opposites. That advanced planning does not always announce itself loudly. That what we call primitive may simply have been invisible to our methods. This reframing matters because it alters the meaning of what comes next. Losing such a system is not trivial. When adaptive knowledge fades, it does not leave ruins. It leaves vulnerability. When the sea removed the land these people knew, it also disrupted the context in which their intelligence operated. They carried their skills with them, but separated from the environment that refined those skills, some knowledge inevitably dissolved. Inland landscapes demanded different rhythms. Coastal wisdom blurred into habit, then into story, then into silence. Understanding the intelligence of these societies sharpens the sense of loss that follows. What disappeared was not just territory. It was a way of reading the world that required constant attention to change. And once that context drowned, the knowledge tied to it thinned with time. Seeing these coastal cultures clearly for the first time makes their absence heavier. Not because they were grand, but because they were precise. Not because they ruled, but because they understood. And once intelligence is recognized where it was previously denied, the quiet disappearance of these worlds feels less like inevitability and more like something fragile slipping away, unseen, beneath the water. The way we imagine disaster is often shaped by endings. We expect a moment that breaks the story in two, a clear line separating safety from loss. But for the people who lived along Europe's ancient coasts, nothing like that ever arrived. The sea did not announce itself. It did not rush all at once. It came the way memory fades, slowly enough to feel familiar, steadily enough to be ignored. At first, change appeared as inconvenience. Low ground flooded more often, paths turned muddy earlier in the year. Camps that had always worked demanded new effort. Families adjusted without naming the cause. They moved slightly higher, waited slightly longer, learned which seasons were unreliable. These changes did not threaten identity or belonging. They felt like weather, not warning. Children grew up knowing a landscape different from the one their grandparents described, yet close enough to feel continuous. Stories adapted quietly. Where elders spoke of dry crossings, younger listeners remembered shallow waters instead. Memory softened differences until they no longer felt significant. No one stood at the shoreline and declared it advancing. It simply did what water does, returning again and again. This pace mattered. The slowness removed urgency. There was always time to adapt, always one more season to test, one more adjustment to try. When ground failed in one place, another nearby still worked. Retreat did not mean abandonment. It meant repositioning, the way people had always responded to change. The margins narrowed, but they did not disappear overnight. Coastal people were particularly skilled at reading such shifts. They noticed patterns inland communities might have missed. Tides lingered longer. Salt crept farther into soil. Certain plants struggled where they once thrived. These signs did not inspire panic. They inspired management. Knowledge was applied to keep life working as long as it could. This is why no generation experienced the loss of land as a singular event. Each responded only to what lay directly in front of them. Decisions made sense locally. Camps moved when necessary. Familiar places were revisited, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The process felt reversible, even when it was not. Over time, what was lost was not land, but reliability. The environment could no longer be trusted to behave as memory promised. Effort returned less reward. Knowledge refined over generations began producing uncertain results. This erosion of predictability mattered more than water itself. Survival depends not on space alone, but on confidence in patterns. Yet even then, departure was rarely final. People returned when conditions allowed. They tested old grounds out of habit and hope. Some seasons rewarded them, others did not. The landscape invited repeated evaluation rather than sudden departure. No moment forced a definitive choice. This explains why there is no collective memory of catastrophe. No single flood or storm carried symbolic weight strong enough to survive retelling. Loss occurred through repetition. Familiarity dulled recognition. What changed felt ordinary because it happened everywhere at once, and nowhere completely. Generations adapted without complaint. They carried their homes lightly, organized life around movement, trusted that flexibility would always suffice. This trust was reasonable. It had always worked before. The sea did not betray them. It simply continued doing what it had been doing already. The emotional weight of this process lies in its quietness. Panic burns brightly, but patience wears away unnoticed. Each small accommodation weakened attachment without breaking it. People stayed until staying demanded more than leaving. And when they left, it was without ceremony. Shrinking margins do not inspire memorials. They do not produce last stands. They produce calculation. When dependable space becomes seasonal, and seasonal space becomes occasional, staying no longer announces itself as wisdom. It becomes inertia, and inertia eventually gives way to movement. Long before land fully submerged, it stopped feeling certain. That shift mattered more than rising water levels ever could. When uncertainty entered daily life, decision-making changed. Risk tolerance adjusted. People favored ground that promised consistency over familiarity. Movement became the safer choice. Seen from a distance, this gradual retreat appears invisible. From within, it felt ordinary. Families did not mourn the land as they left it because they did not believe they were leaving forever. They believed they were adjusting, as they always had. This is why the loss of coastal Europe does not resemble disaster narratives we recognize. There was no final moment of awareness, no shared realization that something irreplaceable was ending. Knowledge dissolved alongside geography, leaving behind no sharp edges for memory to grasp. The most dangerous changes are not the violent ones. They are the ones that allow adjustment just long enough to prevent resistance. Sea level rise in ancient Europe fit this pattern precisely. It did not demand flight. It encouraged patience until patience no longer served. By the time coastal lands were truly gone, they had already faded from decision-making. Movement had become routine. Migration felt reasonable. What remained was not grief, but continuation elsewhere. From this slow unmaking comes the next quiet step. As stability weakened beyond usefulness, people did what they had always done. They moved. Not in panic, not in defeat, but in search of ground that still answered back. And in that movement, the story shifts from loss too slow to feel, toward migration quiet enough to miss, carrying lives forward while leaving places behind. When people speak of lost cultures, they often imagine disappearance as something abrupt, a people wiped out, a language silenced overnight. But the communities who left Europe's drowning coastlines experienced nothing so final. They survived. They carried their children inland. They adapted, as they always had. The loss that followed was quieter, and in many ways more unsettling, because it did not feel like loss at all. As coastal lands grew unreliable, movement became gradual and practical. Families relocated to higher ground season by season, not abandoning their past but folding it into the present. Camps once used every year were visited less often, then only occasionally. then not at all. Routes shifted, new patterns formed. No ceremony marked the change. Survival demanded attention forward, not backward. When people arrived in already occupied areas, they did not arrive as strangers carrying a distinct ending behind them. They blended. Knowledge mixed. Skills merged. Small differences softened through shared labor and intermarriage. Languages overlapped, borrowing sounds and meanings, until edges blurred. What had once been specific became general. What had been carried deliberately became habit, then instinct. In these processes, nothing failed. People succeeded at what mattered most. They lived, they adjusted, they ensured continuity of bloodlines rather than continuity of place. But memory suffered quietly. When a culture dissolves without being destroyed, there is no shared moment of remembrance. There is no final story to tell. Traditions tied to the coast lost their function inland. Tidal timing mattered less. Methods refined for wetlands felt inefficient elsewhere. Knowledge did not vanish, but it adapted, reshaping itself to match new landscapes. What could not adapt was not preserved. It simply stopped being used. Over generations, the origin of these practices faded. Children learned what worked where they lived, not where their grandparents once lived. Stories shortened, then disappeared. Names lost their meaning. The past was not rejected. It was unnecessary. This is how erasure happens without violence. Memory depends on relevance. When relevance fades, so does recall. No one forgets intentionally. Life moves faster than reflection. What no longer solves immediate problems falls away, even if it once defined existence. From the outside, this process appears as absence. No monuments remain to mark departure. No distinctive artifacts survive long enough to anchor recognition. Later observers see silence and assume emptiness. But silence is not absence. It is continuity without context. Many of the people who moved inland carried no sense that they were leaving something forever. They believed in return, in cycles, in opportunity shifting back again. That belief had always served them well. Only time would reveal that this change was different. Languages are particularly sensitive to such shifts. Without written form, they rely on community concentration to survive. As populations scattered and merged, linguistic patterns weakened. Words tied to coastal features fell out of use. Concepts lost reference. Over time, they vanished quietly, leaving no trace identifiable centuries later. What endured were elements flexible enough to adapt. Stories stripped of geography, myths detached from location, practices generalized until origin became irrelevant. Memory survived only where it could function in new places. Later civilizations would look inland for ancestors and heritage, unaware that their roots stretched beneath the sea. Genealogy continued, unbroken, while history fractured. The line of descent remained intact. The line of narrative did not. This creates a strange imbalance between survival and remembrance. Lives continued successfully. Knowledge continued selectively. But identity linked to place dissolved entirely. The shoreline, once central, became distant, then abstract, then forgotten. What troubles modern understanding is not that these cultures disappeared, but that they succeeded without being noticed. We are accustomed to connecting importance with impact, collapse, or dominance. Quiet integration leaves no obvious footprint. There is no villain in this story. No conquering force erased these people. No disease marked their end. The environment shifted. People responded. Memory did not keep pace. This challenges assumptions about what it means for a culture to survive. Biological survival alone does not preserve identity. When land disappears, relationship to place goes with it. And without place, memory becomes fragile. The unsettling idea is simple. A people can live on while their world does not. Their children may thrive somewhere else, unaware that entire ways of understanding once shaped their ancestors. From the perspective of history, it appears as though nothing was lost, because nothing dramatic occurred. But something was lost. Not in a single moment, not in a way history could easily record, but across generations, through usefulness replacing attachment. The past softened until it dissolved. This is why the disappearance of Europe's submerged cultures feels so complete. They did not resist change. They moved with it. And because they moved successfully, they left little behind to insist they had ever been distinct at all. From forgotten people, the story must now turn to what outlasted them unintentionally. Objects that did not migrate, footprints that did not travel, Traces left where lives unfolded, still resting where memory no longer points. If people could be absorbed and forgotten, then perhaps what they left behind remained, waiting quietly beneath water and soil, carrying stories people no longer remembered how to tell. Along Europe's coasts, there are practices so familiar they are rarely questioned. Fishermen set out on specific tides without recalling who first chose them. Villages mark the start of seasons, with small rituals that feel customary rather than sacred. Place names cling to rocks, inlets, and stretches of water, even when no one can explain what the words once meant. These traditions feel rooted, yet when traced backward, their roots vanish before reaching firm ground. Some coastal communities still avoid certain waters at particular times of year, not because danger is recorded, but because habit insists. Nets are cast in patterns passed down without instruction. Boats follow routes learned by watching rather than teaching. No one claims authorship over these choices. They are inherited without explanation, performed without reflection. These customs are often mistaken for survivals, remnants of ancient belief carried intact into the present. But survival suggests intention. What remains along the coast feels different. These are shadows rather than relics, habits that outlived their purpose, continuing because repetition is easier than replacement. Language holds similar traces. Along many shorelines, place names resist modern logic. Words translate cleanly into nothing familiar. Their sounds feel older than the languages now spoken around them. Names once designed to describe wetlands, inlets, or tidal boundaries remain, even though the landscapes they referred to have changed or disappeared entirely. The words stay after meaning drifts away. Seasonal customs reveal the same pattern. Coastal festivals often align poorly with modern calendars, but precisely with environmental shifts. The timing no longer matches necessity, yet tradition preserves it anyway. What was once practical rhythm becomes symbolic gesture. The action remains, the reason dissolves. These practices persist not because people understand their significance, but because continuity itself feels meaningful. Repetition reassures. Customs ground communities, even when their origins are unclear. Over time, explanation feels less necessary than performance. What makes these remnants unsettling is their age. Some traditions likely formed before current coastlines existed. They were shaped somewhere else, then carried forward as people moved inland or outward, adapting behavior while forgetting why adaptation was required in the first place. As environments changed, practices adjusted enough to remain useful, then continued out of comfort. Each generation inherited routines already detached from their context. The customs no longer pointed to landforms or waters that still existed, yet they continued shaping behavior indirectly. This is how continuity survives erasure. Meaning fades before action does. Knowledge thins until only movement remains. The gesture outlasts the story. Looking closely at coastal traditions reveals layers of quiet endurance. Fishing methods that match ancient migration patterns longer than recorded history. Seasonal timing aligned with tides that rarely expose what they once did. Words spoken, whose original references lie underwater. These are not secrets deliberately hidden. They are leftovers, disconnected signals echoing from environments that no longer frame daily life. What makes them powerful is their ordinariness. They do not demand belief. They do not insist on memory. They simply continue, unnoticed, because stopping them would require explanation no one possesses. This continuity challenges the idea that cultural memory is preserved through awareness alone. Much of what lasts does so invisibly. Identity can carry fragments without knowing it is carrying anything at all. These traditions suggest that loss is not always clean. Parts of the past leak forward unevenly, embedded in routine rather than story. They persist until circumstances change enough to make them irrelevant, and sometimes not even then. From the outside, these customs appear local, minor, ordinary, but their persistence hints at something deeper. They are evidence of worlds carried forward unintentionally, of lives reshaped without leaving records explaining how or why. Some traditions truly are older than the land where they now occur. They were learned in different places, under different skies, beside shorelines that slipped beneath the sea long before written memory reached them. Not every inheritance travels clearly. Some arrive fragmented, stripped of explanation, carrying only enough logic to remain useful. These customs live in that space between memory and instinct. As the story moves onward, the focus shifts inward. From outward habits carried by quiet repetition, attention returns to people themselves. If customs can survive without origins, then the question deepens. What else might still linger beneath identity, shaping who we are without ever announcing where it came from? History often treats the sea as a divider. It separates nations, shapes borders, and defines who belongs where. But beneath that familiar idea lies a quieter truth. Water can erase land without erasing people. Long after coastlines vanished, long after paths were cut away by rising tides, those who once lived there did not disappear. They moved. And in moving, they carried something history failed to follow. In recent years, genetic studies have begun to complicate the story that archaeology alone could not finish. Patterns hidden inside DNA suggest long periods of mixing between populations that modern geography insists should have been separate. These connections do not align neatly with inland routes or later migrations. Instead, they point outward toward regions that are now submerged. When researchers compare genetic markers across Britain, Scandinavia, and mainland Europe, they sometimes find closeness where distance is expected. These relationships appear older than recorded history, older than farming, older than stable settlement patterns. They imply shared ancestry across areas now divided by sea, ancestry difficult to explain unless people once moved easily across land that no longer exists. DNA does not remember place names or coastlines. It remembers movement. It records proximity, repetition, and exchange. In this way, it becomes another archive hidden beneath water, one that remained intact while physical landscapes vanished. Where stories blurred and objects sank, biology carried forward quietly, generation after generation. These findings do not suggest a single culture or a unified people. Instead, they reveal zones of repeated contact, areas where people met, married, and shared life across centuries, regions that functioned as crossroads rather than edges, places that modern maps treat as separation lines once supported continuity. The assumption that water creates isolation works only when water is present. Before the sea rose, those connections were ordinary. Travel required no vessels, no courage. Relationships formed naturally through shared space. When the sea arrived, it interrupted pathways, not people. As coastal groups relocated, they did not vanish into anonymity immediately. They merged into nearby populations, bringing with them genetic signatures that persisted even as cultural markers dissolved. Over time, these signals spread, softened, and blended further. The land that once explained their closeness disappeared, leaving behind patterns without visible cause. This is why some genetic links appear mysterious when viewed through modern geography. Without acknowledging submerged landscapes, the data suggests improbable movement. With them, it simply reflects daily life. What makes this continuity grounding is its indifference to narrative. DNA does not exaggerate. It does not romanticize loss. It records quietly, without interpretation. Through it, the story becomes less speculative and more human. People adapted to environmental change not by fragmenting into isolated groups, but by carrying connection forward. Even when land failed, relationships did not. Family lines crossed new boundaries, without knowing they had once crossed different ones entirely. This reframes disappearance again. Coastal cultures did not end. They diffused. They became part of what followed, contributing silently to later populations who never knew their full story. From the outside, this looks like rupture. From within, it was continuity without attachment to place. The sea erased familiar ground, but bloodlines flowed onward untouched. Children inherited traits, molded by environments their parents gradually forgot. Over generations, physical adaptation outlasted cultural explanation. This challenges the way history defines survival. Preservation does not require memory. Continuity does not depend on self-awareness. People can carry ancestry without carrying stories, identities without origins. The deeper implication is unsettling. Entire populations may live today with roots in places that no longer exist, unaware that part of their lineage belongs to lands beneath water. Heritage, in this sense, sinks as easily as stone when it lacks framework to remain visible. This does not diminish later cultures. It deepens them. It reveals layers of connection beneath familiar narratives, suggesting that identity is less anchored than imagined. It drifts, adapts, and reforms, guided by necessity rather than preservation. What genetic evidence restores is humility. It reminds us that history's gaps are not empty. They are filled with lives that continued without leaving names. Evidence remained not because it was valued, but because it was carried forward unintentionally. DNA becomes a record of paths erased from maps. It signals that people crossed spaces later claimed by the sea, often enough for connection to matter. The loss of land did not sever humanity, it redirected it. This also explains why myths and traditions sometimes feel incomplete. Cultural memory faded faster than biology. Stories require relevance. Genes only require survival. In environments that changed too much to support old explanations, stories thinned, bodies persisted. As the narrative moves forward, the focus shifts away from questions of proof and toward meaning. Evidence now suggests that nothing truly ended. It simply continued somewhere else, beyond recognition. From this point, the story turns philosophical not to escape uncertainty, but to address its weight. When people persist without remembering where they came from, what does loss really mean? If land can disappear while life continues, then perhaps the most fragile element is not survival, but awareness itself. And it is there, in that awareness, that the next chapter begins. For a long time, history was written where it was easiest to reach. Not out of neglect, but practicality. The ground beneath our feet felt stable, visible, cooperative. It could be walked, dug, measured, and mapped. What lay inland left marks that survived ploughs, settlements, and centuries of reuse. Stones stayed where they fell. Walls emerged when soil was peeled back. Evidence rewarded effort with confirmation, so attention remained there. Water asked for more. It demanded equipment, patience, and risk. It gave little back quickly. For early researchers, the sea appeared not as a keeper of history, but as its opposite. What fell into water was assumed lost, scattered, dissolved beyond recognition. This assumption settled quietly into method. Archaeology grew around what could be reached by shovel rather than by descent. Cost reinforced the bias. Excavating land required labor and time. Excavating underwater required technology still developing, along with training few possessed. For generations, resources followed certainty. Funding moved where results were most likely. The past that cooperated received focus. The past that resisted was postponed. There was also trust in the visible record. Written history, where it existed, referenced inland centers of power. Cities rose on rivers. Kingdoms formed away from unstable edges. What could be documented appeared inland, reinforcing the belief that what mattered had always been there. Coasts became margins in both geography and thought. Assumption completed the pattern. Early humans were believed to favor caves, valleys, and high ground. Coastlines were seen as temporary, unreliable, unsuitable for sustained life. These ideas felt logical when shorelines were imagined as narrow and static. The possibility that entire plains once lay beneath the sea rarely entered discussion. This framework was not enforced. It emerged organically. Students learned what their instructors had learned. Tools were built for land. Questions formed around accessible evidence. The absence of underwater data was mistaken for absence of underwater history. When anomalies appeared, they were often explained away. A tool found offshore became drift. A structure beneath water became geology. These explanations felt reasonable because they matched expectation. Challenging them required more than curiosity. It required changing methods, budgets, and belief. There was no single moment of refusal, no deliberate turning away. The blind spot formed gradually, shaped by convenience, constraint, and inherited perspective. It remained unexamined because it worked well enough to explain what could be seen. Technology, for a long time, reinforced this division. Sonar was developed for navigation and defense. Diving favored exploration over excavation. The seafloor was observed in fragments rather than as landscape. Context. Archaeology's most valuable element was difficult to preserve underwater. As a result, the sea became a boundary for inquiry, rather than a field within it. History stopped at the waterline because methods did. And when methods shape questions, questions shape memory. What makes this blind spot troubling is not exclusion, but confidence. Conclusions were drawn with assurance that felt justified. Timelines hardened, migration routes were defined, settlement models stabilized. All of it rested on evidence that was geographically incomplete. This does not diminish what archaeology achieved. It explains its limits. No discipline can investigate everywhere at once. Choices must be made, but choices have consequences, especially when they persist unexamined. The moment those limits began to soften came not through accusation, but interruption. Industrial encounters with the seabed forced reconsideration. Accidental discoveries did what theory had not. They pressed evidence upward, asking to be acknowledged. Only then did it become clear how thoroughly the sea had been excluded. Entire regions vanished from maps of human activity, not because they were empty, but because they were submerged. The coast had been treated as an edge rather than a foundation. Once this realization settled, resistance gave way to reassessment, not of facts, but of framing. If early humans followed resources rather than ideology, then coastlines made sense as centers, not margins. If sea levels changed, then settlement patterns must be reimagined. The blind spot was never about denial. It was about habit. Knowledge moved along well-worn paths, until those paths widened or gave way. Only then did alternatives appear. Institutional reflection followed slowly. Underwater archaeology expanded, not as replacement, but as correction. It did not overturn history. It completed portions left unwritten. Understanding why we did not look earlier matters because it tempers interpretation. It prevents overreaction. It keeps discovery grounded. The absence of evidence was not proof of absence. It was a reflection of where attention rested. The most important insight may be this. History does not fail when it is incomplete. It fails when it mistakes incompleteness for conclusion. For a long time, that mistake went unnoticed because it felt reasonable. Now that blind spots are named, the burden lifts. New perspectives open not through skepticism alone, but through humility. What was missed, not through error, but through structure. With awareness comes opportunity. The sea no longer marks the end of inquiry. It becomes another beginning. And once history accepts that its vision has limits, it gains the freedom to look again, deeper, in places that were always there, but rarely considered. The story moves forward not to correct the past, but to widen it. Once a single blind spot is acknowledged, it becomes difficult to look away from the horizon it opens. If parts of Europe's human story lay hidden beneath water for so long, not erased but overlooked, then the question naturally grows larger. Absence stops feeling contained. It spreads outward, unsettling certainty elsewhere. Europe is not alone in experiencing changing coastlines. Across the world, seas have risen and fallen, exposing land and then taking it back. Continental shelves once stood dry in many regions, now submerged. Pathways became channels. Plains became seafloor. If human life followed resources rather than borders, then similar stories may lie quietly beyond familiar maps. This possibility does not require speculation about lost empires or advanced civilizations. It requires only acknowledgement of scale. When sea levels were lower, coastlines extended farther outward everywhere. People walked across spaces now defined as ocean. They lived where it made sense at the time. That simple fact reshapes global prehistory far more than any singular discovery. The comfort of believing Europe exceptional gives way to unease. If its missing chapters went unnoticed for so long, other regions may be similarly incomplete. Places where archaeology has relied on visible land may repeat the same bias without recognizing it. Shallow seas surrounding continents become suspect. The edges of Southeast Asia, the submerged shelves of East Asia, the broad plains, once connecting islands long separated by water. Each region carries oral traditions, place names, and unexplained genetic links that may trace paths now underwater. History's map begins to feel provisional rather than final. What we know becomes less authoritative, not because it is wrong, but because it is partial. Established timelines no longer collapse, but soften, allowing unmet questions to exist without immediate resolution. This expansion of possibility is uncomfortable because it resists closure. It invites imagination without offering clarity. For viewers drawn to mystery, this tension is productive. Not knowing becomes an invitation rather than a flaw. What matters here is not what must be added to history, but what may need reconsideration. Migration routes once drawn straight may have passed through spaces now inaccessible. Cultural exchanges assumed unlikely may have been ordinary. Separation mistaken for isolation may have begun as connection. The implication is modest but profound. Humanity's story is not missing because evidence vanished maliciously. It is missing because our methods aligned too closely with present geography. When landscapes change faster than memory, knowledge falls out of step. Underwater spaces represent both uncertainty and promise. They resist excavation in familiar ways. They require patience. They reward moderation. They simulate scarcity until attention shifts. This reshapes how discovery is imagined. Instead of waiting for dramatic ruins to announce themselves, attention turns to subtler signs. Objects out of place, patterns that repeat, anomalies that refuse dismissal. Speculation here is not escape. It is method. It allows attention to loosen enough to notice what certainty ignored. It keeps the narrative open without requiring resolution. The knowledge that something is missing does not demand immediate recovery. It demands restraint. Recognition alone shifts perspective. It alters how questions are asked and where curiosity is aimed. In this space, wonder returns without urgency. The viewer is not told what to believe. They are asked to sit with incompleteness, to accept that understanding may arrive slowly, unevenly, in fragments rather than conclusions. This quiet expansion of uncertainty mirrors the very processes described earlier. Just as ancient people adapted without panic, modern understanding adapts without collapse. It widens rather than breaks. The sense that Europe's submerged story is part of a larger pattern deepens rather than diminishes its importance. It becomes one case within a broader human tendency to forget what slips beneath attention. From this recognition, focus naturally shifts toward recovery. Not recovery as conquest or confirmation, but as careful reassembly. The task ahead is no longer to prove loss dramatically, but to listen patiently where silence has been mistaken for absence. Once absence is understood not as emptiness, but as invitation, the story changes direction. It leaves speculation behind, not to abandon it, but to ground it. From what might be missing, attention turns toward what can be found. The seafloor waits without urgency. It does not advertise its contents. It preserves and withholds equally. Recovery will not come through declaration, but through deliberate return. And in that return, the missing may not resolve fully, but it will begin to shape understanding in ways history once believed complete. The past did not rise to meet us. We learned to descend toward it. For centuries, the seafloor was imagined as blank space, a dark interval between coasts, useful for travel, but empty of story. Maps drew it smooth and uninterested, a surface meant to be crossed rather than read. That assumption held not because it was proven, but because nothing challenged it. Water concealed detail so completely that absence felt natural. The change did not come through revelation, but through perception. Sonar did not arrive as an answer, but as a sense humans had never possessed before. Sound became substitute for sight. Pulses travelled downward, struck what lay below, and returned carrying shape. Not clarity at first, just suggestion. Shadows expressed in distance and delay. When early scans appeared, they were interpreted narrowly. Technicians searched for hazards to ships, routes for cables, formations that mattered to navigation. But beneath those practical aims, something else emerged. Lines appeared where curves were expected, patterns repeated too consistently to ignore. The seafloor refused to remain abstract. With finer resolution came coherence. What had appeared as noise softened into form. Slopes aligned, channels traced paths that mirrored rivers on land. These were not random scars. They followed logic. They obeyed gravity, flow, and destination. Once seen, they could not be unseen. The most unsettling realization was not that features existed, but that they connected. Paths extended beyond the limits of individual scans. Crossings appeared at predictable junctions. What emerged was not chaos, but order. A landscape, quiet and continuous, settled beneath the water. Roads are not expected underwater. Yet shapes appeared that resembled them, not as straight stone lanes, but as worn corridors shaped by repeated movement. Riverbeds submerged but intact revealed branching patterns, unmistakable to anyone familiar with dry land. These were spaces shaped by use, not accident. The seafloor began to read like a palimpsest. Layers of sediment hid and revealed selectively. Some features stood proud, others hinted through slight elevation or depression. Interpretation required patience and restraint. No image spoke alone. Meaning emerged through alignment. What sonar did was not uncover objects. It restored context. It showed how features related to one another. It allowed distance to be measured without sight. It allowed terrain to be imagined rather than guessed. This was a profound shift, Archaeology had long depended on exposure. Digging removed layers to reveal what lay beneath. Sonar reversed that relationship. It scanned without touching, preserving while exposing pattern. Damage was minimized. Understanding increased. With each improvement in technique, the ocean floor grew more articulate. High-resolution mapping traced coastlines that no longer existed. Shelves widened. Plains stretched outward. The scale of lost land became comprehensible for the first time. It was no longer possible to imagine early coasts as narrow strips. What emerged were vast regions that could support life for generations. Spaces once dismissed as marginal proved expansive and fertile. The sea had not erased them evenly. It had sealed them. Seeing the seafloor also revealed continuity across modern boundaries. The shapes did not respect national borders. A channel crossed where maps insisted separation. A shelf extended beneath water, connecting lands assumed distant. Geography corrected assumptions quietly, without argument. For viewers, this kind of discovery carries a different weight. There is no drama, no single moment of astonishment, just gradual recognition. The sense of reading something long hidden because no one learned how to look properly. The technology itself refused myth. It offered no story, only data. Yet the shapes produced did what stories had hinted at. They confirmed connection without naming it. They implied human presence without insisting upon it. Interpretation remained cautious, deliberate, grounded. This method rewards humility. Sonar does not reveal everything. It suggests more than it shows. Every shape carries margin for error. But when many shapes align, when patterns repeat across regions, doubt shifts direction. The question becomes less whether these features matter, and more how they were overlooked for so long. The ocean floor stopped being empty space. It became terrain, familiar in structure, unfamiliar in position, a place where understanding required new habits of attention. Importantly, nothing rose dramatically into view. There were no sudden revelations waiting upright beneath waves. The past stayed where it was. Only perception changed. Our vision sank rather than the past resurfacing. This reversal matters. It keeps discovery grounded. It prevents triumphalism. What was found had always been there. Human capacity finally caught up. With this new sense, history began to reassemble itself. Migration routes gained depth. Settlement models extended outward. Questions once abstract gained dimension. Seeing did not answer everything. It made asking possible in better ways. The seafloor, once silent, now speaks through contour and alignment. It does not confirm legends. It does not replace evidence found on land. It complements it. It stretches context outward. Seeing leads to interpretation. And interpretation, once grounded in landscape rather than imagination, opens the next phase of inquiry. If the terrain beneath water can be read, then meaning can follow cautiously behind. The story now turns from perception to understanding, from shapes to significance, from recognition to careful inference. The seafloor has become legible. What it says requires listening just as patiently as the sea required studying. For a long time, maps and history books told the same story. What lay on the page appeared to match what lay beneath the ground. Settlements followed, rivers still visible. Migration routes traced valleys that remained intact. Geography and narrative reinforced one another, creating a sense of completion that felt earned. The seafloor disturbed that balance quietly. As underwater maps became clearer, they did not destroy existing histories. They unsettled them. New shapes appeared where old models had left blank space. Land existed where history assumed water. Connections emerged where isolation had been accepted. The past did not contradict itself loudly. It disagreed gently, persistently, forcing re-evaluation rather than rejection. Historians are trained to respect sources. Archaeologists are trained to trust context. Sonar and mapping data did not behave like either. They did not offer names, dates, or stories. They offered terrain. That difference created tension. Landscapes suggested possibilities that written records could not confirm or deny. This is where discomfort entered. Models of early settlement depended on visible land masses. Timelines formed around locations that could be dug into. When maps revealed extensive lost plains beneath water, those models no longer felt sufficient. Movement could have occurred where none was imagined. Communities could have formed where history placed only sea. The difficulty was not adjusting facts, it was adjusting assumptions. History had relied on absence as evidence. When absence dissolved, certainty weakened. What replaced it was not chaos, but uncertainty, structured by possibility. Inland records spoke of arrival. But where had people arrived from? Seafloor maps suggested routes now erased. Coastal migration ceased to look marginal. It began to resemble the primary pathway, now inaccessible to verification through traditional means. This mismatch does not invalidate what is written, it reframes it. History books preserved what was visible to those recording them. They never claimed to record everything, but over time, their completeness was assumed rather than questioned. Maps disrupt that assumption. They present landscapes without narratives, forcing imagination to follow evidence rather than the reverse. A submerged valley raises questions no chronicle can answer. A dotted route beneath water implies movement no text recorded. For thoughtful skeptics, this tension is familiar. Evidence rarely fits comfortably inside established frameworks. Yet frameworks persist because they organize understanding. The challenge lies in allowing them to bend without breaking. Some responded by resisting interpretation altogether. Without artifacts or writing, how much could be said responsibly? Others leaned too far into certainty, eager to replace one narrative with another. But the truth lived between these reactions. The discomfort came from recognizing that knowledge had grown confident on partial ground. History had been built upright on a tilted foundation without realizing it. The maps did not overturn the structure, they revealed the slope. The question becomes subtle. What happens when evidence refuses to fit the story? It does not demand abandonment. It demands pause. In that pause, new humility enters. Scholars begin asking differently. Instead of, where did this happen? The question shifts to, where could this have happened? Instead of narrowing timelines, they widen context. Uncertainty, once treated as weakness, becomes space for thought. It allows multiple explanations to coexist without collapse. It invites restraint rather than conclusion. This shift does not feel satisfying in the way answers do. It feels incomplete. But incompleteness aligned with honesty is preferable to certainty built on omission. The public often expects discovery to clarify, to resolve mystery into fact. Here, discovery does the opposite. It deepens uncertainty while strengthening confidence in complexity. Maps and history books no longer align neatly because they never represented the same scope. One recorded terrain across time, the other recorded memory across circumstance. When those scopes interact, friction is inevitable. This friction is productive. It prevents premature myth-making and guards against denial. It acknowledges that landscapes change faster than records adapt. The deeper tension lies in authority. Written history carries cultural weight. Maps derived from technology carry scientific credibility. When they disagree, neither yields easily. This standoff does not end in resolution. It ends in awareness. An understanding that history, like land, shifts beneath attention. Ambiguity remains unresolved, not because answers are impossible, but because patience is required. More data may come, or it may not. The seafloor gives selectively. Reflection becomes necessary. Without it, discovery risks becoming noise. With it, uncertainty becomes meaningful. The story pauses here not to conclude, but to breathe, to hold the mismatch without forcing harmony. To accept that, knowing where our frameworks fail, is itself progress. With ambiguity acknowledged, the narrative slows. From tension, it turns inward. Understanding is no longer about proving what was lost, but considering what loss means when certainty dissolves. The next movement is not toward explanation, but toward reflection, where unanswered questions are allowed to do their quiet work. When we imagine the end of a civilization, we picture collapse. We expect chaos, desperation, and violence. Cities burning, people fleeing, a final moment that demands to be remembered. This expectation is so deeply rooted that when it does not appear, we assume nothing significant happened at all. But history, when viewed without drama, tells a quieter story. Some societies do not fall, they simply step aside. The coastal cultures of ancient Europe did not fail in the way later ages define failure. They did not exhaust their land through excess, nor were they overrun by enemies. They did what had always sustained them. They adjusted. When the coastline shifted beyond usefulness, they followed stability rather than defending familiarity. Their strength lay not in permanence, but in responsiveness. To an outside observer, This looks like disappearance. To those living it, it was practical decision-making repeated over generation after generation. When fishing grounds no longer returned enough food, people moved inland. When seasonal camps lost their value, they were replaced. No ideology anchored them to place. No monument demanded loyalty. Land was relationship, not possession. This kind of adaptation leaves little behind. Graceful retreat does not produce ruins. It does not create dramatic markers for history to catalogue. Instead, it dissolves continuity so gently that later observers mistake it for absence. The narrative comfort of collapse replaces the reality of choice. The moral weight of this realization arrives slowly. It challenges the belief that endurance must be visible to matter. These people survived precisely because they did not mistake land for identity. They carried their skills rather than their boundaries. That mobility became their resilience. Later civilizations would celebrate expansion, fixation, and permanence. Walls rose to hold ground in place. Cities declared themselves unmovable. Writing reinforced loyalty to location. Those values produced visibility, memory, and records. They also produced rigidity. Coastal societies chose differently. Retreat was not abandonment of culture. It was reconfiguration. Knowledge adapted to new environments. Practices shifted inland. Social units condensed or spread depending on necessity. What mattered continued. What did not was released without resentment. This reframing alters how loss is understood. The disappearance of coastal settlements was not a failure to persist. It was a refusal to sacrifice life for symbolism. The land had changed. The appropriate response was movement, not defiance. From a distance, centuries later, this appears as emptiness. No stone cities mark the record. No texts recount the decision. History moves on, assuming simplicity where intention once lived. But adaptation is not simplicity. It is strategy enacted quietly enough to avoid legend. Survival is easy to overlook when it lacks visibility. We notice collapse because it interrupts. We miss adaptation because it flows. Civilizations that retreat gracefully leave behind fragmented traces rather than testimonies. They do not announce their wisdom. They practice it. This perspective carries uncomfortable resonance today. Modern societies are built around permanence. Borders, infrastructure, and economies presume stability. Retreat is framed as defeat. Movement becomes failure rather than foresight. The ancient coastal cultures challenge this bias without accusation. They remind us that endurance does not require dominance over environment. It requires alignment with it. When alignment fails, release becomes wisdom. Their gradual migration inland did not erase their existence. It redistributed it. Communities reformed. Genetic continuity persisted. Cultural markers softened. The story did not end. It stretched thin until boundaries dissolved. History struggles with thin endings. It prefers decisive moments. Yet most of human experience flows between extremes. Adaptation rarely arrives with spectacle. The idea that civilizations can retreat gracefully feels counterintuitive because it denies conflict its central role. It suggests that cooperation with change, rather than resistance to it, can be a form of strength. That notion unsettles modern instincts shaped by conquest and permanence. The coastal cultures of prehistory offer no manifesto. They leave no warnings carved into stone. What they leave is example, recorded indirectly through absence. Where land failed, they did not insist. Where memory thinned, they did not preserve it artificially. They trusted continuity to take different forms. This does not mean nothing was lost. Place matters. Knowledge tied to specific landscapes dissolved when those landscapes disappeared. Some understanding could not transfer. Graceful retreat carries cost, but it avoids annihilation. The moral undertone of their story is not instruction, but implication. Survival is not always loud. Wisdom is not always celebrated. Some of the most durable human responses leave the least visible traces. As the sea rose, these cultures did not challenge it. They stepped back, allowing the environment to dictate terms rather than ideology. In doing so, they preserved life, even as place dissolved. From the perspective of history books, this looks like erasure. From the perspective of living systems, it looks like success. And once adaptation replaces collapse as the lens, the story opens outward. If ancient peoples could retreat without failing, what does that suggest about our modern anxieties? What if disappearance does not always signal defeat? and movement is not always loss. From past adaptation, modern parallels begin to emerge quietly. The lessons do not arrive as warnings, but as reflections born from patience. Change does not always demand resistance. Sometimes it rewards release. The story moves forward, carrying this reframing with it. What happened beneath ancient seas does not stay there. It ripples into how we understand endurance itself, suggesting that the most persistent civilizations may be the ones willing to leave without insisting on being remembered. At certain moments, standing near the water feels different. Not dramatic, not dangerous, just quietly unfamiliar. Modern cities press close to coastlines with confidence, their streets aligned to maps that assume stability. Glass towers reflect waves as if they were permanent features, decorative and contained. From a distance, the arrangement appears deliberate, even timeless. But beneath that certainty lies an older pattern, one that does not announce itself unless we pause long enough to notice. Ancient shorelines did not look ancient to those who lived beside them. They were simply present, reliable, ordinary. People built near water because it offered food, movement, and connection. It felt sensible to stay close. Over time, familiarity hardened into assumption. The land had always been there. It would continue to be there. No one expects the ground beneath daily life to change while life is busy unfolding. Today's coastal cities echo that same logic. Ports expand, neighborhoods grow outward, infrastructure presses closer to the edge, not out of arrogance, but practicality. Water still offers access, trade, and beauty. The reasons are sound. They have always been sound. This parallel is not a warning. It is a reflection. The people who lived along Europe's ancient coasts made reasonable choices with the information they had. So do we. They trusted patterns that had held for generations. So do we. Change arrived not as rupture, but as revision. The past often feels distant because we imagine it differently. We fill it with rough tools, sparse populations, and uncertainty. But the people who once stood where water now covers land shared something deeply familiar. They built lives within environments they understood well enough to trust. They made plans for tomorrow based on yesterday's success. Standing on a modern shoreline, it is easy to believe that advanced knowledge creates protection. Satellites track weather. Engineering resists erosion. Models predict change decades ahead. Yet knowledge does not eliminate normalization. Gradual shifts still feel manageable until they accumulate enough weight to matter. Ancient coastal peoples normalized change because change came slowly. Modern societies normalize it for the same reason. Sea levels adjust. Infrastructure adapts. Mitigation replaces prevention. Life continues, and continuation becomes proof that decisions were correct. The mirror is subtle. It does not accuse. It observes likeness. Humans respond to environment in consistent ways across time. We stay until staying becomes inconvenient, then negotiate, adapt, and recalibrate. Movement is delayed not by ignorance, but by hope that adjustment will be enough. This is where reflection becomes uncomfortable, not because catastrophe is imminent, but because history reveals how easily comfort aligns with delay. The ancient coastlines did not disappear while people slept. They transformed over lifetimes. Decisions always felt premature until they felt late. Modern cities stand tall at the edge of water, with confidence earned through invention. But invention does not change tide. It extends timelines without cancelling them. What technology buys is time, not certainty. The parallel continues at a quieter level. Ancient knowledge about coastlines faded as people moved away from them. Today, urban life distances experience from environment. Sensors replace observation. Data replaces intuition. Awareness shifts form. Not better or worse, different. When ancient people returned seasonally to testing grounds that no longer worked, they trusted memory until reality corrected it. When modern cities reinforce shorelines, they trust models until conditions revise them. The cycle is familiar. History recognizes it without judgment. The lesson here is not to retreat or to resist. It is to understand how perception shapes timing. People adapt successfully when they leave, before necessity strips choice. Ancient cultures who retreated gracefully preserved continuity. Those who delayed too long lost options without realizing when they disappeared. Standing where they once did means recognizing that safety often feels strongest just before it becomes conditional. Familiarity convinces. Stability reassures. Change announces itself too quietly to demand immediate response. This recognition is not despairing. It is grounding. It places modern life inside a longer human rhythm of response and adaptation. Nothing we do now is unprecedented. Only the scale feels new. Late at night, when noise fades and the shoreline empties, the parallel becomes easier to sense. The water moves with the same patience it always has. It does not rush. It does not threaten. It simply follows gravity and time. Cities rise to meet it, believing that reasoned design will hold. History does not contradict that belief. It contextualizes it. The people before us believed equally in the continuity of their arrangements. They were not foolish. They were human. Understanding this shifts the story away from fear and toward humility. The question is not whether modern coastlines will change. They always have. The deeper question is how societies respond when the familiar becomes negotiable. From this vantage, the past does not warn. It resonates. It reflects modern presence back at itself without demand. We are not being challenged. We are being recognized. History doesn't repeat, but coastlines do. Not as punishment, not as lesson, but as process. The land adjusts. People follow. Memory fades. Continuity reappears elsewhere. This reflection does not call for conclusions. It invites quiet awareness, a recognition that standing at the edge of water places us inside a story longer than our structures and deeper than our planning. As the narrative reaches this point, it begins to loosen its grip. There is no need for urgency, no need for declaration. The understanding has already settled. From here, the story does not push forward. It drifts. From reflection comes stillness. From awareness, silence. The water continues moving, as it always has, carrying what it will carry, indifferent to observation. The chapters ahead no longer need movement. They need space. In that space, history rests, not as warning or instruction, but as presence. From warning, the story releases itself into quiet, leaving only the shoreline, the water, and the understanding that time does not require announcement to reshape the world. There are histories that insist on being seen. They rise in stone, stretch toward the sky, and demand attention through scale. They leave ruins that slow time, forcing the present to acknowledge the past by walking through it. And then there are histories that leave nothing upright at all. No pillars to photograph, no walls to measure, only absence where presence once felt certain. The submerged cultures of Europe belong to this second kind. They did not mark themselves with endurance in mind. They lived in ways that did not require permanence to feel complete. When their landscapes disappeared, they left no monuments behind to announce what had been lost. And yet, their story remains, not because it can be pointed to, but because it continues to shape what came after. The sea becomes central in this understanding, not as destroyer, but as archive. It did not tear these cultures apart. It covered them. It sealed moments in place and preserved them without narrative. Objects remained where they were last used. Landscapes froze into new forms. Time slowed beneath the surface in ways it never does on land. Archives usually feel intentional. They are curated, labelled, and built to protect memory from erosion. The ocean does the opposite. It preserves without care for meaning, without sorting importance from ordinary life. It keeps the extraordinary and the mundane equally. Hearths sit beside tools. Footpaths fade beside riverbeds. Nothing is elevated. Nothing is dismissed. This kind of preservation demands humility. It resists closure. It refuses to deliver clean stories or moral resolutions. Instead, it holds fragments patiently, allowing interpretation without insisting upon it. The past does not explain itself here. It waits. What makes this unsettling is how complete life was without leaving monuments. These cultures did not lack significance because they lacked stone architecture. They lacked durable remains because durability was not their priority. Their intelligence lived in timing, movement, and relationship to change. Those qualities do not fossilize easily. Modern memory struggles with this. We are trained to associate importance with visibility, to remember what stands and forget what dissolves. But visibility is not value, and permanence is not proof of relevance. The ocean reveals this quietly. By holding so much without announcing it, it undermines assumptions about what deserves remembrance. It shows that vast stretches of human life unfolded without any intention of being memorialized. meaning existed without performance. Life was lived without anticipation of being studied. This reframes loss in a subtle way. What was lost was not history itself, but the kind of history we recognize easily. The past did not vanish. Our usual methods simply stopped seeing it. When divers recover tools or hearth remains, they are not uncovering secrets meant to stay buried. They are encountering ordinary moments that happen to fall outside the line of sight of written record. These objects do not ask to be revered, they ask to be acknowledged. Acknowledgement is quieter than celebration. It does not require certainty. It accepts incompleteness. It recognizes that understanding does not always arrive through explanation. The ocean, as archive, offers this model. It preserves without interpretation. It gives without commentary. It allows many futures of meaning rather than one authorized past. There is gentleness in that. The sea does not punish these cultures by erasing them. It grants them anonymity without negation. Their existence does not depend on recognition to remain real. As the story arrives here, speed gives way to stillness. The urgency that once accompanied discovery fades. There is no need to chase final answers. What matters has already surfaced. Memory without monuments does not demand attention. It does not compete with louder histories. It simply exists, waiting for moments of curiosity to intersect with patience. It surfaces slowly, incompletely, and without schedule. This is not failure of preservation. It is a different form of it, one that stores life rather than legend, routine rather than drama, continuity rather than climax. The humility required to accept this is the quiet closing of the journey. To recognize that not everything worth remembering announces itself, that some truths are carried forward indirectly, scattered across geography, language, biology, and habit. When we imagine lost worlds now, they no longer need to rise from the water as intact cities. It is enough to know they were lived fully, adapted gracefully, and carried forward invisibly. The ocean no longer feels like an adversary in this telling. It becomes keeper rather than enemy. It holds what it has always held, without regard for our desire to know it quickly. As modern attention turns outward, scanning depths and mapping shelves, it does so not to conquer the past, but to listen more carefully. To accept that preservation does not require completeness to be meaningful. This is where the story slows to a stop without ending. Not because there is nothing more to say, but because nothing needs to be resolved. The past has been recognized, not reconstructed. The final understanding settles gently. History does not owe us clarity. It does not exist to instruct or warn. It exists because people lived. And those people, whose coastlines slipped beneath the sea without ceremony, did not need monuments to matter. They needed only to live while the land allowed it, and to move when it did not. What remains is enough. The story releases its grip here, not with a conclusion, but with quiet acceptance. The sea continues doing what it has always done. Memory drifts where it will, and understanding, unburdened by certainty, is finally allowed to rest.